So, thank you so much, everyone, for coming along today. I'm Daniel Pidcock. I'm a UX designer and researcher. I'm known as the creator of Atomic UX and also founder of Gleanly, an Atomic UX-based knowledge repository. And I want to talk a little bit about where this all started. And a while back, I was working for Just Eat, the world's biggest food marketplace. And they're a FTSE 100 company, massive, platform. And I was working as a UX designer and researcher, working mostly the mobile apps. And I'd recently founded and I was running the accessibility team there as well. And the company had grown massively in that time. I'm going to put myself in the corner there. They had grown massively in the time I was there. And, we had designers, researchers, business analysts, all sorts of people doing research around the globe. And this work would be mostly written up in reports or put into then Google Drive, never to be seen again. And in fact, we used to call it Google Grave because it's where research went to die. And all this knowledge was getting learnt and lost and learnt again. And each project we'd spend probably 2 weeks in discovery, which in this case actually just meant trawling through Google Grave to see what we could find, and knowing that so much hard work, expensive work that we spent a long time creating was being lost. And quite often it would even be the situation I would say, I know I've got some research. I did some research on this and I'd struggle to find it and share it with people. So this was a serious problem and one we were all very much aware of. Now, I recently founded and was leading the accessibility team, and this team was unusual in that it had representation from every part of the company, because accessibility affects every part of the organisation after all. So it was great because everyone had really got behind the idea of being more accessible, and there were lots of passionate people really excited to be a part of it. However, it meant that we had an avalanche of research and reports coming in for all around the company and across many countries. That was the sound of the avalanche happening. So for our little team, this was impossible to manage. It was just an absolute, we just couldn't, it was overwhelming. We didn't know what to do. And the biggest issue we had was that the knowledge was being delivered in the form of reports, which obscured the insights. And it also made it really hard to quickly gather information to find out what we already knew. But then when we pulled the insights out of the reports, we lost all that valuable context that the report was supplying. So we needed a mixture of that. We wanted to keep the context, but lose all of the noise around it. So I decided one approach on this might be to theme this research to make it more discoverable. The idea was within those themes we'd have specific insights. The researchers and people supplying knowledge could connect what evidence they had to support an insight. And then if they had a new insight that didn't seem to be covered, they could create a new theme. And others might say, actually, I've got something to support that, and they could add their research to that one as well. And in this way, we kind of had self-managing nodes of knowledge. And we realised one piece of evidence could support multiple insights across multiple themes. This is where it started getting really complicated. And then when we started turning those insights into actionable recommendations, which also could be supported by multiple sources, it became completely unmanageable. So it's time to formalize this process and work out a way to deal with this. Now, I'm often credited as the inventor of atomic UX research. In fact, I just introduced myself as such. But it's important to mention this work came about due to the collaboration with many people and also inspiration from other existing processes. I remember someone showing me a process called DIKW, and which is kind of quite similar, slightly different approach, but certainly it was kind of a slightly more scientific approach, but the more aimed at scientific research, if that makes sense. And we kind of felt that there was something in that. And actually, one person in particular I want to shout out is David Yates. So David Yates is a great UX designer and researcher, and he first gave me the spark of this process when we were talking about the problem he was drawing on the board, very similar to what you can see there on the left. And he was drawing this kind of like, data turns into knowledge, turns into wisdom, or maybe that could even be principles. And what he was drawing reminded me of Atomic Design by Brad Frost. So probably all the designers in the chat would recognize this already. Tell you what, actually, pop into the chat. What's your job title? Are you a UX researcher, a designer, product owner, some other job title? Be really interesting to understand what backgrounds you all have. So this was atomic design process is one we're already using. And I think it's an absolute necessity now if you're creating a design system to build it around the atomic structure. And I thought, well, if we can break down a complex UI design into small atomic parts to make it easier to manage, maybe that would work for knowledge too. So after a lot of work and finessing with many people inside and outside of Just Eat, this is what we came up with. A deceptively simple process with 4 distinct parts or atoms that create molecules of knowledge. And it starts with experiments. This is what we call the thing we did to discover the knowledge. And it doesn't need to be as formal as an experiment. In fact, a lot of people prefer the term study or activity for this. Feel free to change the terminology to suit you better, right? We shouldn't get too caught up on terminology. But this could be anything from a large-scale study to just overhearing something on a bus, but it gives context for the facts. Now, the facts are what we learn. This is the knowledge. This is the finding. And a good fact is a quote, an observation, or a statistic, but it's never our opinion. And ideally, it shouldn't be raw data either. And I'll talk about why in a moment. And insights are our opinion of why the facts are the way they are. Facts should never be our opinion, but insights can be. This is often the cause or the effect of the evidence, the connection between the fact and the recommendation. So finally, recommendations are what we think we should do with this knowledge. We did the experiment, we learnt the facts, we've synthesize those facts into insights to try and understand what we think they mean, what the cause or the effect might be, and then recommendations of what we're going to do next, the actionable result of what's come before. And what's really important is most recommendations are testable, which creates new experiments, and the cycle continues. And this is the secret to creating a scalable knowledge repository which both retains the what and the why. And also, most importantly, the decisions that are made and then what happened afterwards. And each of these atoms connect together to create a molecule of knowledge. And in fact, actually, a lot of people call these nuggets due to the great work that Thomas Sharon's done on the subject. But that simple process becomes really powerful when you see it from the perspective of each of those elements. So what we're looking at here is a molecule or nugget from the perspective of a fact. This is usually the perspective we use when we're creating knowledge and synthesizing our findings. We start with the facts, work out to insights and recommendations. A fact always belongs to an experiment. You can see that the experiment is surrounding it. And this is because how it was learnt, how the fact was learnt, is intrinsic to the fact. You can't separate the two. But a fact can be connected to many insights. So this one's connected to 3. And this is great because we might have several ideas of what the evidence is telling us, but we don't need to argue about one idea. We can think broadly and have explore lots of reasons why the facts might be the way they are. And it's also important that we can connect negatively to an insight, and that's what the red dashed line there represents. This fact is evidence for those 2 insights at the top and against this insight at the bottom. Okay. And now we're looking at a nugget from the perspective of an insight. So this insight is actually connected to lots of facts, in this case across 2 experiments, but there could be unlimited number of experiments. Ideally, the more experiments and type of evidence you can have, I think is especially really useful. A mixture of qualitative and quantitative really gives us confidence in our insights if we've got evidence coming from different areas. And we can also see it's connected to several recommendations. Once again, we can have lots of ideas springing from one insight. Now, I like to synthesize my research with my cross-functional team, and having the ability to have a range of ideas is really wonderful. I'm from a design background, so I tend to be biased towards solving problems with UI solutions, but a database analyst would likely to have innovative ideas that I would never have thought of. Having people with different backgrounds and different ways of thinking and different ideas really is helpful. And also it means I can share that knowledge, people can be included in that knowledge, and it makes life easier as well. Share the pressure of doing this work, right? So this view tends to be the view that other researchers find useful. So I'm most interested in what you've learnt and the evidence behind an insight, but perhaps less interest but curious about what you're going to do next. Alex asks, so each evidence is a nugget or each individual facts are nuggets? So this is why I prefer molecule rather than nugget, because basically what we're doing is we're seeing the world from the perspective of this insight. This insight, this what is connected to facts, both positively and negatively. It's got evidence for and against it, and it's got evidence from different parts of the organisation, or maybe even evidence from outside the organisation. There's different sources that provide support or evidence against this insight. And this insight is also connected to recommendations. But if I go back to going the other way, if I go back to the fact, we can look at a fact or an experiment and see the insights they're connected to and the recommendations they're connected to. And they might be connected to the same ones, right? And so what we're doing now is switching that view now to what the world looks like from this recommendations point of view. And this is the view that stakeholders and decision makers love. We want to be able to show them the recommendations along with the thinking or insights that led to this idea and the evidence that supports those insights. So we're able to show them a holistic view that makes it really clear what evidence we have for and against and allow them to make informed decisions. And stakeholders can understand the evidence at the level that makes sense for them. They can scan the insights, glance at the evidence, or really go deep into each experiment and get an in-depth understanding of how the facts were learned. And what's great for us as researchers is we only need to share one of these molecules. The stakeholder can self-manage their level of detail they prefer. And perhaps they might have evidence of their own or be aware of evidence that we're not, and connect that up and add to this view. It might be that they have their own ideas of what the insights mean and they can create their own as well. But we can mix this knowledge and information together and create this kind of node of understanding. And one of the greatest things really is because we can share these recommendations as deliverables, when we've done research into this, clients tell us that this process reduces the reporting by between about 70 and 80%. So it really is a massive time saver as well. Remember, you're using atomic research as a synthesis process. I know lots of people who only use it for synthesis. They do their research, they use this process as a format to better understand what they learned, and they get a lot out of that, even if they're not trying to create a repository. But when we're doing this in a way that is creating a shared repository, it means that we don't, at the end of that process, need to go and upload it into a document or something, or into a system. It's already there by the very fact that we were doing the processing. We don't need to, in all circumstances, create a report or a new asset, because we can share the asset we created just through the synthesis process. So it is a real time saver. Matteo asks, how do we calculate the evidence score? Now, when at the beginning, this is something that's evolved over the time I've been working on Atomic, is at the beginning we felt the evidence score was a really, really very important part of the process, and it still was very useful. But I've kind of learnt my lesson that sometimes organisations can get a bit too focused on it, and it can be quite detrimental if you do so. So the evidence score, the way that we do it at least, is each fact is worth 1, either +1 or -1, and that cumulatively creates a score telling you how much, or giving you an idea of how much evidence you have for something, how many pieces of evidence you have for something. Now, we actually did a lot of work creating a weighting system and an algorithm of truth, where we actually kind of weighted different types of evidence and different experiments in different ways. Also, how old the evidence was, how contextually relevant it was to your part of the organisation, things like that. And what we found is it was actually really accurate. It was really quite clever, and surprisingly spot on in most situations. But the negative was people got really focused on the score, and even worse, started making decisions on those scores. And the reason that's bad is the evidence score doesn't know what evidence is contextually relevant to you. So yeah, I might have hundreds of pieces of evidence from a source, or one piece of evidence from another one, but that one piece of evidence is really compelling. It really tells me a lot, or really kind of gives me a lot of confidence, whereas lots and lots of evidence from another source may not be so compelling, may not be as useful. Also, a high score doesn't relate to importance either. So especially when it comes to recommendations, actually, sometimes a really important recommendation might not need a high score before we grab it and get hold of it and get it sorted. Quite often I do see that an insight with a high score, they very often correlate with a principal insight. The fact that there's a lot of evidence means it's probably affecting a large part of the organisation. And so not always, but very often, a high scoring insight quite often is a useful principal insight as well. So it can be useful for that. The reason evidence score is useful, I've just talked a lot about why you should be cautious about it. The reason it can be useful is if I need to quickly run into my repository and find an insight or find a group of insights, but I haven't got time to look at all the evidence, the scale of evidence or weight of evidence behind it can be a shortcut for saying, yeah, we've got plenty here, but you should be cautious about that. If possible, it should be the way that Atomic is structured. It makes it very easy. You'll have very quick access to the evidence, and therefore, ideally you should read through that evidence and make sure that you agree that it's relevant to you. Maybe it was relevant to the original researcher that created the insight, but in your context it might be slightly different. For example, I'm working on a product and I'm working on that product in Germany, and someone else is working on that product in Japan. Now, those cultures are very different. They're all humans at the end of the day, so the Japanese research should be a good signal to me that there's something in this, but the cultures are still very different, and perhaps something that works in Japan may not work in Germany, right? Hope that makes sense. Feel free to ask more questions on that subject. Happy to go deeper. So, after a lot of work on this process, I wrote an article on Medium, and this was my first article that I actually wrote, and I didn't have a following, but that article was viewed, it's about 80,000 times now, and sparked a conversation that went around the globe. And I knew it was getting really big when it became the foundation for the European Commission for Research's team. And now many organisations, from massive tech companies, you can see Uber on there, and I think Amazon are using it, and a few others, BBC and all sorts. And we're definitely working with some massive tech companies and government institutions that are using the atomic process to manage their knowledge. And as I say, the process was designed to solve the problem of creating a repository that scales. And I think it has the greatest effect in a large organisation where there's a lot of research, a lot of knowledge, and it's very difficult to manage. But as I mentioned earlier as well, I do know lots of individual researchers, maybe people who don't even have a repository, they're just using it as a synthesis process. I'm not going to say it solves every single problem, of course it doesn't, but I definitely feel that for in most situations, it at least reduces some of the work and adds a really nice framework to work around. And it's very much taken a life of its own now with all these people using it. And many people have their own methods and tweaks to the process to make it work better. And this is something I very much support and very much welcome. Everyone's organisations are a little different. So take what I tell you as a starting point and feel free to use it as you wish. But with that in mind, let's talk about practically how we can use this in our work. So I'm going to start with tools. What tools can you use? Now, the most simple, cheapest and most obvious way to get started is with good old sticky notes, either physically or using a tool like Miro or FigJam if you want to use a digital tool. And this is how I began testing the process within teams. And I see many people still use this for initial affinity mapping and synthesis and such like. And the way we've done this is, as you can see on this whiteboard, we've basically affinity map the findings on the top third, so we just roughly grouped them. And then the next level is the insights. And what we've done is just simply drawn connections with a whiteboard marker, either green if it's a positive connection or red if it's a negative connection, if it's evidence against. And this works great for group synthesis. It's very visual and very tactile, but it can get messy if you have lots of research, especially if you want to connect from opposite sides of the board. And so it's very great for physical, but not so good for storing or for sharing as well. This is pretty much fine for a workshop, but it doesn't really make for something you can put into a repository. But it's a good place to get started just to see how you feel about the process at all, right? This next one I'm going to show you is Airtable. Now, this is the first tool we moved to when we tried to create a repository out of this process. And this is great for remote teams. Most people have Airtable or something similar already. Insights and recommendations, the way that we approach it is we set them up as tags, so you could be very easily reused. The issue we had with this is it was limited in scale, very easy to break, and not very approachable for non-researchers. And let me go back to the bottom corner here. So there's actually a few Airtable bases already set up to get you started if you wanted to try Airtable. So this one is by Thomas Sharon, who I mentioned earlier, who's been a great thinker in this space. So he created the Polaris Airtable base, which he created when he was head of research for WeWork. And it's really useful. But perhaps a bit focused on WeWork and their specific needs. And I find it a little bit confusing as someone who's spent the last however many years now, 5 years, 8 years or whatever, I don't know, a long time focusing a lot on research repositories and Atomic in particular. I find it not very approachable still. What I find actually is a slightly simpler one, maybe a better one if you are thinking about using Airtable to get started with, is this one by Martin Guillaume at Devo Team. And I think this is a bit more approachable. They started using this with their consultancy clients and kindly shared it with others to benefit from. So we tested many products. As I said, we used Airtable. We tried to use some of the incumbent repository tools out there, but we kept on coming up against different problems. So with Airtable, we found that it had limitations on scale, not in terms of how much data it could store, but it would very quickly become clunky, and it was especially unapproachable by stakeholders in particular. It's very hard to really understand what was going on. And of course, the stakeholders, the people who are making decisions with the knowledge that we're creating, they're the most important people, right? The other thing we found really difficult is I was showing you earlier how you could swap a view, how it's useful to be able to see facts connected to insights and those insights connected to recommendations, like branching out, and also useful for stakeholders to see it branching in. So facts, lots of facts going into insights, going into the final recommendation. And we couldn't really find a way of creating that switchable thing with Airtable or any other tool, really. And maybe there's one out there now that can do this, but at the time we certainly couldn't. So I really didn't want to do this, but we ended up having to create some custom software for this. So I built an MVP with my colleague and friend David Barker. And we started with working with 5 quite large UX teams in different companies who were really struggling with this problem. We're really keen to solve that problem, and were willing to kind of invest in us and trust in us when we had the most. When I say a basic MVP, there literally wasn't search in the first version, but they were willing to work with us, and that also gave some investors confidence, and we got some VC funding, which allowed us to hire a team. And I think it was October 2 years ago now, we launched Gleanly live as a atomic-based repository for anyone to use, and now we've got thousands of users. As I say, from individual researchers to large blue chip organisations, quite a lot of banks and government organisations as well. And we created Gleanly because we wanted a tool built for purpose. Now, obviously, I don't want to go on a full-on sales spiel here. What I'm telling you today can be used with whatever I'm talking about can be used with most tools and without any specific tooling. But if you wanted to give Gleanly a go, it's something that's built for purpose. There's a 30-day free trial, and I'd love to see you on there. So with the little sales spiel over, let me move on. I've lost my mouse. There it is. So next thing I want to talk about is where it sits in your workflow. At what point do you start with the atomic workflow? As I mentioned, it shouldn't be at the end. It shouldn't be a thing you do after you've completed your research and you've created your findings and you've reported to everything. But what we don't want to do is start with the raw data. So we mentioned earlier that that facts are quotes, observation, or statistics, but they're not raw data, and they're certainly not our opinion, right? So survey data is a really good example of this, and one I go to a lot. So it's not helpful to record a fact that respondent 637 said yes to question 6. It's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. That fact, we're trying to make bite-sized, understandable things for our stakeholders, right? Whoever's looking at this should be able to look at it and be able to understand why we're making that recommendation, why that evidence supports that that insight. So in the case where we've got a survey where we've asked quantitative questions, like, do you prefer green clothes or red clothes or whatever? What colour do you prefer? Then it'd be best to summarise that, saying 64% of respondents claim they prefer green clothing. If we've asked the question, why do you like a certain colour, and they're giving more long-form qualitative responses, then that's absolutely fine to bring in as it is, right? But what we want is useful human-level knowledge that helps people create actionable insights. So we want to collect raw data and turn that into findings, then synthesize that into understanding so we can make decisions. Those decisions then actioned, and then we need to review and test them to see if they worked. And this starts the loop again. And it absolutely is the case that we might have a recommendation that spawns experiments that creates knowledge and more insights, or that ends up supporting or disproving that recommendation, so coming around in a loop. Very often a recommendation would be retested and we learn new things, and it might spawn new insights and new recommendation and go off in different directions as well. That's perfectly normal and exactly what we want, right? So the good news then is you can keep on using the tools and the processes and the methods that you love to create the knowledge. They create the data and turn it into something more consumable. So I've given some examples of tools there. These are just examples. You don't need to use these ones specifically, but Power BI, fantastic at gathering large amounts of data and then being able to summarize that into something that's understandable. Qualtrics, great for surveys, and SurveyMonkey is great as well. Maze is a great product as well for what they would output, they might call insights. And this is a really important thing. What they call insights, we would probably call facts, right? Because they're not their opinions on what the evidence is. They're saying these people have problems with this, or they're enjoying using this, or whatever that may be. Hope that makes sense. So we can use our same tools and methods for research and analysis, creating the knowledge that comes around into your repository. or into the atomic flow at least. We use the atomic flow to turn those findings into insights, into decisions, into recommendations, and those recommendations would then be handed over to a project management tool like Jira or something like that. Once those changes or whatever it may be have been implemented, then we want to test and review those. Or we might say, we might have gaps in our knowledge. We might say, right, we've got this fact here and I've got this insight, but I need this to do this new experiment or this new discovery to find out more about this. So we might go back around to the research and analysis. So it's not a circle, more of a figure of 8 in that regard. Hope that makes sense. Now I want to go back to this screen here. I said we want to record the findings but not the raw data. And in this case, we have a survey where the majority of respondents have said that they prefer green clothing. It would not be useful to say respondent 1 said they prefer green and respondent 2 says they prefer green. So we've kind of collated that into a statistic, right? But also by doing so means we can have more interesting insights. And actually what I'm showing you here is a recreation of an actual interaction I had with a client. So they were a French fashion brand, they still are a French fashion brand. And their original question to me is they had this survey result. Their customers had said that they prefer green clothing much more. And they said, oh, is this an insight? Because their survey tool was saying, well, these are your insights from your survey. They said, should that go in as an insight or was that a fact? And I said, it's a fact that this has come from the survey, right? It's a fact that people in that survey have said that they prefer green clothing. Does that make sense? Now, the reason I say it's a fact that they said that in that survey is, well, we still don't necessarily know that's true. Surveys are not infallible. It could have been that people were lying for some reason. It could have been that green was the first answer and they just chose that. It could have been that the section of customers that they were surveying just happened to fall into that demographic. But of course, we can find other evidence. So one piece of evidence we can find is perhaps the buying habits. Your customers have said they prefer green clothing. Is that reflected in sales data? And very quickly, they're able to go into their tools for their sales data and go, yeah, actually, we're selling a lot of green clothing. Depending on how you cut it up, actually, about 44% of all their items were green. This is 230% higher than the average purchase rate for other colours. They had something there, right? So they had two pieces of evidence from two separate sources showing that, yeah, actually, there's something going on here. What we don't know yet is why, but we can use insights to start speculating. Insights don't have to be facts. They're not facts, they're insights. They are our kind of view on why it is. So, for example, I've put there, maybe our branding is particularly attractive to those that prefer the colour green, right? Now, in that case, that brand, they didn't really have green in their logo or their advertising as far as I could see, so I don't know why it was. But, maybe that could be an idea. This is some evidence that we have a group of our customers do seem to be unusually receptive to the colour green. So what's causing that? What can we think that might be the cause of that? But also, what's the effect of that? Are we missing out on selling red and blue clothes? Are we just cutting ourselves off against that opportunity? Or do we actually have an opportunity to be the green clothing company? And of course, we can create some recommendations for actionable things to do next. So we can test logo variants to see if it attracts a wider audience. We could A/B green items on the homepage. And this is actually a suggestion that came up in that meeting. Someone said, tell you what, if people love green so much, probably the first thing we should do is swap out the hero image on the homepage. And they ran that as an A/B test, and I wish I could remember the results. I spoke to them about 4 or 5 weeks after this conversation, and I asked them about this, and they said, yeah, we had a considerable uplift when we swapped out the homepage image. So they got real benefit from this. But the reason I love this example is it was a real example of how thinking of facts as being facts and insights are our opportunity to be a bit more hypothetical, to play with the information, grab different things from different places, bring them together and going, right, this looks like this might be the thing, right? Oh, wait a minute, there's something else over there. That changes my mind and allows me to think wider and broader and come up with some better ideas. And by moving what we might think of as an insight into a fact, it becomes the beginning of the journey rather than just maybe an interesting tidbit to share at a meeting. Now, Julia asks, what are the benefits for freelance researchers with different clients? So I'm going to pause quickly and take that question because I think that's a really interesting question. So if you're an individual freelance researcher and you're using this process just for yourself, perhaps a repository isn't that useful for you. I'm going to make that assumption first of all. Then in which case you may just find the process as a useful way to think about knowledge. Particularly I find, and the most common most common feedback I get from researchers, even very mature researchers, is I was doing my research and I had a good idea of what I thought we were learning. And then I started processing it through the atomic process and it made me think differently about it. It made me think broader. And the key thing there, I think, is the insights. So often it can be so easy to go, the customer said this, so we're going to do that. The user did that, so we're going to do this, right? It's obvious. Okay. But pause and think, what's the insight? What's the thing on the insight? You've got a fact and you've got a recommendation there, but what's the thing that goes in the middle? And so often I hear people say, oh, that's obvious. It's obvious. I don't even need to write it. And I go, if it's so obvious, it must be easy to write. Yeah. And quite often those ones where it's obvious, they're the hardest insights to write, especially for myself. I'm not very good at writing insights. So I know some people can just write the most beautiful insights off the top of their heads. I normally take 3 or 4 attempts before I get anything even remotely usable. But that process of going, right, so the customer did this and automatically I felt that we should do that, but what is the thing that connects those two? And very often that going, maybe something simple like, oh, the customer couldn't find the button, or well, it was because it's on the right, it needs to be on the left. Okay, but why is on the left better? You know, asking that question, what's the cause of it being on the left being a problem? And why does it being on the right solve that problem? Those questions are really useful. And these may be something you're already doing in your research, but I think having a formal framework that helps you through that and forces you to think in terms of not only what did we learn, but what does it mean? The other thing I find is quite useful for maybe less mature researchers or non-researchers doing research is forcing things as a fact. Quite often non-researchers or very junior researchers might say, oh, well, in our research, we learned that this was the case. And very often I can say, well, how did you know that? For instance, customers couldn't find the button. I was like, well, okay, how do you know that they couldn't find the button? What was the evidence behind that? What was the fact? Well, they took a long time to find it. And then you review the video and you see when they were asked to go and click on the button or find that new section, a conversation started about the weather or something. And so they were just distracted, perhaps. Maybe they couldn't find the button, but actually we don't really have that evidence. It's the researcher's bias, or the person who did the researcher's bias there. And so being able to, as much as we kind of want to move things to the facts and have insights as something that's more exploratory, also being able to challenge a fact and going, well, how do you know that? Now, we know that respondents claim they prefer green clothing because they responded that in the survey. That's really clear, but when I'm writing a fact as well, it should be, customer 2 took 3 minutes to find the button and commented that it must be around here somewhere, something along those lines, right? It makes it really obvious why that person was why we think that person was struggling to find the buttons. So I think having that framework is really useful to keep us to help us do better research and get more out of it. Now, another thing, I've got a bit caught up on this subject, sorry about this. But another thing is quite often, even as a freelance researcher, you might be working in an area, and you might want to be able to take knowledge that you've learned from one place and use it to help another. Now, of course, the issue there is sharing potentially confidential research with customers. So you might want to have your own repository, your own collection of knowledge, and be able to go, I was working with that client, we solved that problem like this. You might need to anonymize that data, or in some way, if your other client is going to see that, you might need to protect your other client's data there. But it's normal for us to learn things and get more experience and get more knowledge in a certain area, and then be able to use that to help. And Atomic really allows you to have that framework. So I hope I answered your question there, Julia, and let me know if I didn't, or if you've got any further questions on that. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I've gone on a bit of divergence there, but also it's something I want to talk about, so I'm glad. So going back to the original thing I was saying, insight should not just be a summary of the facts. Hypothesize on the cause and effect. Use it as an opportunity. And also, this is probably a good point to mention that we don't actually need to start with the facts or with the evidence. It's perfectly reasonable to start with a recommendation as a hypothesis or an insight as an assertion, right? So if someone comes to you and says, I think we should build this new feature, that's a recommendation. It's actionable, right? Okay, so what evidence do we already have for that? In our repository, we may already have the knowledge to say, this is a great idea, there's a lot of value in this. Or to go, yeah, this is definitely not the right thing to do. Let's absolutely not waste any time on it. Or we might have just a little bit of evidence is enough to kind of get us started, but we have gaps that we need to fill. We can identify what those gaps are and then identify the methods or products we want to use to fill those gaps and answer those questions. And if someone says something that isn't actionable, so I believe our customers prefer cats to dogs. Okay, well, that's not actionable, so I'd add that as an insight and then work backwards. Do we have any evidence already? Have we got data showing pet ownership of our customers, perhaps? Does that make sense? So we can work backwards to see what evidence we have to support or disprove and create experiments to fill the knowledge gaps. So going back to Atomic as a useful framework. So one of the things that I made a mistake about when I first started is calling it Atomic UX research, because it's not UX research, it's not UX knowledge, it's knowledge in general, right? Everyone in an organization works with knowledge. And actually one of the most common needs of people I speak to is being able to de-silo research. So this might be useful for you, Julia, if you're working with different teams and different organizations, having a common way to bring data together, I think is really useful. So it's possible and appropriate to include other types of knowledge. And I think this is a particular strength of Atomic. It's completely agnostic to source. And in fact, we have quite a few companies now that are using Gleanly that don't do any user research at all. They're just not those kind of companies. So we've got a few investment organizations that are maybe using Atomic and Gleanly as a way to gather together different knowledge and different evidence to whether they should purchase or invest in businesses. And one of the most unusual ones is a criminal investigations team studying murders. So think CIA, it's not the CIA, but that kind of organization. And they have, the problem you've got when you're trying to solve a murder or something like that is you have lots of very different evidence, physical crime scene evidence, observed evidence from CCTV, witness statements from witnesses, which is we'd think of as like qualitative research. Lots of data from scientific, and more and more we've got our little kind of secret spies in our pockets, right? And these different types of evidence can be really hard to bring together in a conducive and useful way, but Atomics really help with that. So don't be afraid to bring other people into the research process with you. And so if we can include knowledge from different disciplines, should our knowledge repository be for everyone in our organisation too? And my answer, of course, is yes. And as I mentioned earlier, I believe Atomic is a really useful format for non-researchers to help them be more data-led, more evidence-led, less biased, and also if you're managing that knowledge process, it can be a really low impact way of being able to understand what people are learning, what research are people doing, and keeping an eye on the quality of that and being able to help them if that quality falls below. It's worth looking into Jared Spall's maturity stages of organisations, because it's basically what we're talking about there is infused UX design, infused design thinking. And it's where more and more companies are going. We're definitely seeing that. More and more companies, we're seeing researchers are no longer just doing the research, but as much as anything, managing the transference of knowledge and gathering of knowledge across an organisation. So I think Atomic acts as a really useful framework. It forces people to think about the why rather than just skipping to a solution. And yeah, as I said to Julia, that's one of the big benefits. Oh, and another thing is it really forces people to think about the evidence they have for an assertion and keep themselves evidence-led, divide their beliefs from the evidence itself. So it is possible to game the system, of course, but also becomes really obvious. So in this case, we can see, this evidence doesn't really support this insight or this recommendation. And sometimes I will say, as an aside, quite often when I see an issue with people connecting, say, facts to an insight that maybe mention or have similar keywords, but they don't really support the insight, very rarely that's nefarious, or more the person is maybe slightly, like a less mature in their research knowledge, or maybe just got a bit overexcited. So be gentle with them. And of course, being able to combine existing research from other projects reduces the pressure on everybody, but it also really helps teams build a case for ideas, or perhaps build a case against ideas. We tried that and it didn't work. And remember, this process started from a need to be hands-off and allow people to self-manage their research and a repository to really scale. So this means a small team or even just one person can manage the knowledge for a very large organisation. And one key piece of advice I try to instill, and I'm going to instill on you guys as well, is to try and be light touch. And this can be difficult for us researchers that want everything to be perfectly coded and filed away. But I often tell people it's one of the few areas in life where quantity is more important than quality. It's better to get poorly coded research into your repository than risk losing it. After all, if it's not there, it will never be found. And maybe in traditional insight repositories that rely heavily on tagging and coding, this will be a problem. If it's not tagged, it doesn't exist, or it can mess up our taxonomy. However, with Atomic, because when we connect a fact to an insight or an insight to a recommendation, we're creating a relationship between the two items. You could even say, like, we're coding via stealth. And in the example above, the researcher has been pretty good at coding the recommendations and the insights, but they've not tagged any of the facts at all. Maybe they're in a rush, they don't understand coding, or they're just being lazy. It doesn't matter really, because if we found any of those 5 cards shown above, all the others are connected. And probably other insights and other recommendations they're connected to as well. Any of those could bring us to any of those assets. So I'm not saying taxonomy isn't important, it's very much so, but you need to have a balance between the friction and worrying about having really good quality best practices and being low enough barrier so everyone in your organisation can get behind this and be engaged. That's what we're aiming for, is engagement. Get the engagement first and then work on building up the quality and best practices afterwards. And on that note, actually, we're having a talk next week. I can't remember the date, but next Tuesday, so 7 days to be 17th. And that will be about some of this stuff, actually talking in depth about Atomic, getting really under the skin of it, going into really deep details. We'll have lots of conversation and take very specific questions around that as well. Something I've been thinking about a lot, and I've got lots of opinions on it, so be sure that it's going to be a very opinionated talk, but hopefully useful if you're thinking about using this process within your team. Maybe if you started using it and you want to go a little bit deeper on it. So in summary, what are the benefits of Atomic research? So for synthesis, if you're just using it for synthesis, it removes personal bias, or at least reduces it. It encourages retesting. It forces us to think about the why, often leading to more innovative solutions, and it gives a great framework for non-researchers. And as a repository, it allows scale with low management. We get a holistic view of the evidence from the whole organisation and beyond, evidence for and against, and it allows us to move quickly with confidence, encourages collaboration, and it smooths out tagging issues. And if you're not sure why any of those, because I did kind of skim over some of those items, well, we'll be talking about it in depth next week, of course, but I'm very happy to take some questions. Now, one last thing before I finish, because that's nearly everything I want to say, but I want to leave on this important consideration. Research repositories are not for researchers, they're for decision makers. Now, often the researcher may also be the decision maker, especially of those of you who are UI or product designers. But often there's a stakeholder involved who's maybe a manager or a client, a decision maker. Whatever we do, no matter how thorough our research, how perfect our coding, none of it is of any value if it doesn't help those that need it. If it doesn't help those people make decisions. And this is why I'm so passionate about knowledge management, sharing information, making that information digestible, and helping people make better decisions. It's also why our motto at Gleany is making knowledge usable. And I'd love you to try out the process for yourself. As I say, you don't need to use Gleany for anything I've said today, but if you do, we have a 30-day free trial, and the system starts at just £18 a month after that. We have free access for students and discounts for charities, and I'd love to hear how you get on with our process, with or without Gleany. Please get in touch, LinkedIn or whatever way you'd like to get in touch. Because I'd love to hear about how people are using it, maybe things you've changed, things you've struggled with. Always happy to geek out about this stuff. It's what I do, right? So thank you also so much for Lewis and Larissa for organising these events and making today possible. And if anyone's got any questions, I'll be very happy to take them. Though I will say I've got the parish council meeting in 30 minutes. So I was expecting this to take a little bit shorter. I got sidetracked a few times through there. So I've taken up pretty much the whole hour. So I will have to run away slightly shortly to go and sit in a very boring parish council meeting and hear about planning and all that kind of stuff. But now I wonder if I missed any questions as we were going through. I've just realised as well is I had top chat on rather than live chat as well, so I may have missed some of the things as you were going through. The Atomic UX Taxonomy and Best Practices is Tuesday the 17th of October at 6 p.m. That's UK time, BST. So same time as today, but next week. And I really hope you meet it. You come along. I've lost the power of speech. I'm going to also post that link into the form for the certificate. Certificate form. There we go. So we've created some certificates to say, you understand the basics of Atomic. You can put this on LinkedIn. You can put this in your CV. Use it for whatever you would like. So Katya asked about security, which is a really good question. Can we store company secrets? So if you're asking whether Gleany is secure, we use bank level security. And as I say, we've got several global banks using us and many financial institutions. We've got governmental institutions, got the secret criminal investigation company that I mentioned. So yeah, I spend half my life doing security reviews. It's not fun, but it's important. So Gleany as a product is very much secure. The data's stored in the UK, and if you need it stored in a different location, that is possible as well. But as standard, it's stored in the UK and treated with GDPR level privacy and such like. If you're asking if Atomic is an appropriate way to store secrets, I would say probably not. If you've got something in your organisation that is only for special privileged people, it's on a need-to-know basis, the benefit of Atomic is that everyone can access it, everyone can share things, everyone can network that information. Now, you might be able to go into your Atomic repository and pull out research that supports your secret project, but it's probably not useful or appropriate to put the secrets in there because everyone in your organisation is going to be able to see them, right? Now, if everyone in your organisation that has access to your repository is under NDA and non-complete and all that kind of stuff, that's great. One of the best things about the Atomic process is actually not the storing of information, but it's helping people discover other teams that are working on similar things and sharing those kind of things. One of my favourite things is when two people or parts of the organization start a dialogue because they discovered a commonality in Atomic. Maybe one team was working on something and solved a problem, and another team also need to solve that problem, or they're both working on a similar thing and they decided to collaborate. And for several times now, quite a few times, I've seen whole new products and innovations happen because people who probably didn't even know about each other beforehand started talking and started sharing ideas. That to me is one of the most wonderful things. And as more and more we're working remotely, it can be more and more difficult to have those kind of connections. As much as I am a remote working advocate, even before COVID, I always have been. One of the downsides is you don't quite often have those water cooler moments. You don't bump into someone in the coffee room or over a beer after work and discuss something. You go, oh, we should work together. I think we've got something here we can work on together. So it's important for us to find different ways of doing that. And I think the other side, which is less exciting, is lots and lots of people in our industry move around. Obviously, last year has been a really difficult year, I think, especially for our industry. A lot of companies were letting people go. And now the good news is I read a report last week or the week before that says that's almost down to zero. And a lot of those companies that were firing are now rehiring. So really, I think some positive news. And I think next year is actually going to be a really good year. But it was striking from October the year before, 2022, which till now, it was like billion. You could any UX researcher could get pretty much any job, ask for whatever they wanted, and they were so desperate for researchers. And then it seemed like March, it just went. Pff. Now, but part of that is there's going to be a massive brain drain, right? So many of those organisations that don't have a proper knowledge management solution or process, they've just lost all that knowledge. They've left and taken that knowledge with them, and maybe they're going to rehire them and such like. But there's an incredible amount of brain drain going on. And that's always going to be the case. Even if a company has really good retention, there still will be people moving on and taking that knowledge with them. And a repository is an important way to do that.